Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm hearing some feedback. Okay, this is making sound, FYI. It's not making. Sometimes you can't turn the sound all the way off on Zoom. It's the craziest thing. Cool. Yeah, that didn't work. Okay, is that better? All right, I think that worked. So you guys, I am Steve Schnarr. I'm the Director of River Relief. Welcome. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is our second Big Muddy Speaker Series in person. We've been doing this for 12 or 13 years, which sounds insane, but something like that. And we've already got, I think, twice as many people as our first in-person one last week, which is really cool. And more people are coming in. So you guys, especially all of you at the bar that are still looking for seats, you know, feel free to grab chairs, move tables around so you can actually, you know, see what's going on. This is a beautiful building, timber framed, but the timber frames do kind of get in the way, so you sort of have to play around with where you sit. Good move, hitting the front seat there. Nice work on that, thank you. They're not scared. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but yeah, okay, good point. Now I did brush my teeth, you know, earlier. It's not that bad. So just a couple of things that we have coming up this weekend. Missouri River Relief, we're in fact, tomorrow, a bunch of us are heading to Washington, Missouri, and we're doing a river cleanup. And then our friends in Washington are doing their, I don't know what you call it when it's every other year. Is that semi-annual? Biannual. Excellent. The more or less biannual Washington River Festival, which is music, there's artists, there's an art auction, all kinds of educational booths. There's a bunch of stuff for kids. So even if you didn't manage to get signed up for the river cleanup, it is still a really cool event to participate in and just sort of see that whole community, that river community in Washington, Missouri turn out. Really awesome people. And another thing that well, in June is our Mornings at the River program. And this is designed for kids 0 to 5. So if you know, if you have, or if you know little wee ones, Mornings at the River goes on for 3 weeks. It's the last 3 weeks in June. There's no way I could remember all those dates, so I don't even try. But it's Tuesday and Thursday, the last 3 weeks in June. If you're interested in volunteering, it takes a lot of volunteer effort to put this on. And you could potentially sign up on our little email sign up sheet and say, I want to volunteer at Mornings at the River. And we would love to have you. Or it's a free program. And there's no kind of sign up for that, is there? Or is there? There is. Yes, cool. So on our website, look for Mornings at the River. There's a registration so that we at least hopefully have an idea of how many kiddos we're going to be having scrambling around down there. And that takes place at Cooper's Landing, which is a really nice place for an event like that. And then kind of another big thing we have coming up in July is the MR 340 race, which is a canoe kayak race from Kansas City to St. Charles, 340 miles. And we're looking for volunteer help for that as well. So you can reach out to me about that. That's probably kind of here. That's sort of the best way. The other way you can sign up as a volunteer is through the rivermiles.com website. So those are kind of the two avenues for that if you're interested. I'm curious how many people here are doing the MR 340 race? Carrie. And it is her first time, not her first time on the river. One, yeah. How about you? Not yet? Yeah. Add it to your bucket list. That's all I'm going to talk about tonight. Is there anything else that I'm missing, my friends in the audience? I guess I will say that, like, we did just wrap up 2 weeks of the Missouri River Days program, which theoretically we get every fourth grader in the Columbia Public Schools out on the river. The weather did not allow that. We missed one afternoon, so we've already rescheduled those kids when they're in fifth grade. They're going to come out and do that. But it was amazing. We usually split it up spring and fall, but because of pandemic weirdness in the fall, we were not able to do it. So we piled it all on in 2 weeks. And counting many volunteers twice, I think we had 180 some volunteers that it takes to put this on, along with agency partners, university partners. USGS was out there. Carrie could raise her hand again because she did that too. Department of Conservation, Fish and Wildlife Service, several local artists. Like, it's just this whole big thing. And thank you so much to all of you that came out to make that happen, which is quite a few people. You can go raise your hands too. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, you guys. So the real reason you're here is to learn about this really high-tech, crazy cool US Geological Survey river studies project that happened last year. And we all kind of heard about it. We saw some really cool photographs of it taking place. And we've all been kind of sitting around going, what did they learn? What did they learn? What did they learn? And then so today, Brandon Sansom, a research engineer with USGS, is coming to share some of the data, some of what they learned, what the goals were in this project. And it all took place really starting at the bridge right down here. And that next 6 miles downstream is where it all happened. So excited to hear, Brandon, what you have to say. And thanks for your patience. And Brandon has been kind of a guinea pig. We've been poking and prodding and shining lights in his eyes and stuff. So thanks for, humoring us and making it happen.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve. Hopefully you guys can hear me well. If not, just holler and I'll try and speak up, or we can adjust the mic as needed. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. This is my first time presenting to this group. I started at CERC, the Columbia Environmental Research Center, about a year and a half ago, and this was one of the first big projects that I worked on. So last May, we dumped a lot of dye into the river, as Steve mentioned, just a couple miles downstream from where we're sitting at tonight. And the purpose of this was to evaluate some really complex flows around a restoration or rehabilitation project that's occurring a little bit downstream from here, with the goal to improve the recruitment of the endangered pallid sturgeon. I want to preface this talk by saying that the dye that we released was completely non-toxic. It was safe, and as far as we know, no fish or aquatic life were harmed in the production of this experiment. So I want to start by acknowledging the River Studies branch at CERC. This was a very big project. The day of the experiment, there were at least 16 CERC scientists and technicians out on the river. There were a couple others who had done a lot of groundwork before I started here, did some pilot projects as well. We also had 2 additional USGS offices collaborating with us and collecting some of the remotely sensed data. We had a private contractor flying some flights for us, and then it was funded by the Army Corps and the USGS Ecosystem Mission Area. I also want to take this moment to really just highlight what we do in the River Studies branch and why this work really led to an experiment like this. So we are an interdisciplinary group of scientists, and our main goal and theme is to really inform river management and restoration. As you would expect from an interdisciplinary group of scientists, we have a really wide range of focal points. As you see on the list here, some of these include endangered species. I'll talk a little bit about the pallid sturgeon tonight. This is just a very, very small snippet of the research that we do with pallid sturgeon. We have a group that works specifically on invasive carp. Myself and a few others do some work with freshwater mussels and restoration in the Ozarks. We have some work going on with floodplain dynamics and looking at the ecosystem services that floodplains provide, and as well as the risk reduction of having those floodplains there. And then finally, some data management strategies to better improve river conservation and biology. And again, all of this falls under the broad theme of this adaptive management and collaborative decision-making. So we collaborate with a number of different stakeholders, as well as local, state, and federal agencies, again, with this bigger umbrella in mind to improve in river management and river science. So in this presentation, I am going to start with a very brief background on the context of the Missouri River and the Missouri River Basin. I'm mainly going to focus on the lower Missouri River because that's the geographic context from where this experiment was taking place. I'm going to do a little bit of an overview on the Pallid Sturgeon life history to kind of set the stage for why this experiment was important. And then I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the actual dye experiment. So our two main goals with this experiment were to, one, really evaluate whether or not the channel rehabilitation work that happened at this reach is working as we would expect it to. And then the other part is part of our tool set in river studies is using hydrodynamic and particle tracking models to better understand biological processes and as they're related to hydraulic or hydrodynamic processes. One of the issues with a modeling approach, however, is your models are only as good as the data that you have. And so what this dye study did is it provided us a really good data set to evaluate our particle tracking models and inform the use of those models in our research. And then I'll conclude with some lessons learned and some future work moving forward. So here is the Missouri River and the Missouri River Basin. As you guys are probably well aware, it covers 10 states in the Midwest and the upper Midwestern United States, and the upper portion actually extends into southern Canada. It's a relatively large geographic area. The main stem of the Missouri is the longest river in the United States. It flows over 3,700 kilometers, beginning in western Montana, flowing east and then south through the Dakotas, forming the border between Nebraska and Iowa, and then finally flowing east again through Missouri before it drains into the Mississippi and St. Louis. There are a number of large dams on the main stem of the Missouri River. These are important for a number of reasons, socioeconomic reasons, as well as environmental. They provide a lot of storage capacity in the basin. They also provide a lot of hydropower on an annual basis. And then in the lower river, so everything downstream of Gavin's Point Dam, right here close to Yankton, South Dakota, has been heavily channelized for navigation. So roughly 1,200 kilometers have been channelized for navigation purposes to allow barges and large vessels to move up and down the river. So this evening, we are sitting way down here in the watershed, about halfway between Kansas City and St. Louis, approximately 180 or 185 river miles upstream from the mouth with the Mississippi. I'm going to walk through a few different changes to the river that have happened over the past 150 to 200 years that have really altered the river in a way that has had a pretty profound effect on the Pallid Sturgeon. The first change I'm going to highlight is this change in the hydrologic alteration. And this is mainly due to the damming of the river in the upper river and the regulated flows that are coming out of those basins. So the slides that I'm going to show over the next couple are all set up the same, where the gray shaded area represents the natural hydrograph that would have occurred during the historical flow regime. And then the blue shade represents the regulated river that we see today. So this hydrograph here is at Sioux City, Iowa, so fairly close to Gavin's Point Dam. And what you'll notice is that the regulated river looks nothing like the historic river and the historic hydrograph that we would have expected in the basin. What has happened is we have a decrease in the spring peaks. And so historically, we'd have this dual peak hydrograph with a peak in the late spring and then a second peak later in the summer. Because of the regulation and the management of those reservoirs, we don't see that peak at all. And then the second big change that we see is we actually see an increase in the summer flows. And that is mainly due to having a navigation season and having enough water and flow in the channel to support boat traffic. As we move further downstream, we start to have the influence of additional tributaries coming into the Missouri River. And we start to see the hydrograph, or at least the regulated hydrograph, begin to look a little more similar to that historical hydrograph. However, we still see the reduction in those spring runoffs and an increase in those summer flows. And then the same, again, further downstream at Herman. Here, the shape takes a little bit more similarity to the natural or the historic hydrograph, but we still see the reduction in those spring runoffs and an increase in the summer flows later in the summer. The second big change that I'm going to highlight is habitat changes. What we are looking at here is a rendition of the Missouri River by Carl Bodmer. He was an artist and actually went on an expedition on the Missouri River, went up the Missouri River in the 1830s. This is one of his depictions of the river, and what you can immediately see is the channel is just chock full with this large woody debris. And this would have been pretty common of the river channel in its historic context. Traditionally or historically, what we would have expected the Missouri River to look like is a very wide meandering river, multiple braids and multiple threads, large exposed sandbars or sand islands that you see here. The river would have been well connected to the floodplain. And so during those peak flows in the spring and summer, the river would have spilled out into the floodplain, incorporated a lot of this large woody debris, and incorporate it into the river. And this becomes a very important habitat feature. So it provides a lot of different diverse habitats for aquatic organisms and just provides a lot of unique habitat associated with the river. What we see today, however, especially in the lower river here, if you look outside, it's virtually void of any large woody debris and in-stream habitat features. And then the third big change, especially in the lower river here, is the channelization. I've already mentioned this a little bit. So the lower Missouri River has been heavily channelized for the purpose of navigation. The series of images that you see here are Indian Cave Bend in Nebraska. And if we look at this top figure, this is a pretty good depiction of what the river would have looked like in its historic setting. So very wide, large meander bends. You have multiple threads coming through here, large exposed sand islands. And again, that highlights the diversity of different types of habitat that would have been available to aquatic organisms that rely on a diversity of habitat within this channel. Beginning in the 1930s and throughout the mid 1900s, the channel or the river was heavily channelized to support the navigation industry. And this was achieved by these long crib walls that essentially directed the flow into a very narrow swath. And the purpose of that was to have the majority of the energy in a specific location in the river, so it would be self-scouring and enable a deep enough flow channel to allow those big barges and vessels to move up and down the river. Over time, what happened was the area behind these crib walls would eventually fill in because you no longer had water flowing over there. So you'd have a lot of sediment deposition and land accretion. And now the channel is somewhat confined to a relatively narrow pathway in these locations and throughout much of the lower river. So this is pretty predominant throughout the lower river. Here's another example down at Herman. This is an old map from the late 1800s. As you can see here, a very diverse channel, wide meander bends again, multiple threads coming through, large exposed sand islands, but the river today looks like that. So a much more narrow section. The little red lines that you see here are all dike fields that are helping direct the flow of that water to maintain this navigation channel. Here are a couple other images to support this. So you can see the wing dikes in these L-head dikes here, and you can see how it flows moving from left to right here, how those wing dikes essentially force all that water in a more narrow channel now. And again, the purpose of that is to allow large barges and vessels like this to move up and down the river. Now, in order to understand some of the impacts or effects that has had on aquatic organisms like the pallid sturgeon, I want to pause and just walk us through the life cycle here to get a better understanding of how certain life cycles or life stages within this life cycle are affected by some of these changes. And so I'll start at the top here and kind of just work my way counterclockwise around this life cycle diagram. But here we have an adult pallid sturgeon. They will migrate upstream. Usually it's hundreds of kilometers or more until they find suitable habitat to spawn. Typically what they're looking for is some hard or rocky substrate to spawn over. And when that happens, the eggs will be fertilized, and then they will actually incubate for a short duration of 4 to 7 days. After the incubation period is complete, they will hatch, and then they will initiate a rather long drift phase where the embryos will passively drift downstream. And during this time, especially during the first 10 to 11 days, these embryos are just passively drifting downstream and really subject to the movement of water and where the water will direct them through their course. So your question was, is a lack of woody debris really affecting what part? Their life cycle? Correct. And so what happens is that woody debris provides a lot of different diverse types of habitat, provides not just the physical habitat, but the hydraulic habitat to create more suitable habitat and more suitable flow fields for these smaller organisms to seek flow refugia, to seek habitat for foraging, things like that. And so if these embryos are lucky enough to survive that drift phase, they will begin to swim on their own and feed on their own after a period of 11 to 14 days, at which point they'll continue to grow into juveniles and eventually into sexually mature adults. And that can take another decade or so to reach sexual maturity. Now, in this life cycle, there's a natural bottleneck in this early life stage where there's a really small survival chance of those eggs and embryos that naturally happens. And we also know that if the embryos are successful enough and complete that drift phase and they reach the juvenile phase, there's a much higher chance of survival. So about a 60 to 90% chance of survival once they get above 50 millimeters and begin to grow or begin to swim and feed on their own. Now, ironically, a lot of those changes in the habitat also affect this same bottleneck. And so it further exacerbates some of these really delicate life cycles. So as she mentioned, the large woody debris and the lack of that has altered the habitat. The channelization in the lower river has forced the drift phase to go in a much more concentrated area where they don't have access to a lot of the channel margins that they used to. And so this drift phase becomes a really delicate phase in their life cycle as a result of many of these modifications. And so the other effects on the pallid sturgeon, I just mentioned a little bit about the importance of the drift phase, and I'll touch again on that here in a second. But the other big one is the reduction in their native range and their historic range. So on the graph here on the left, the red resembles the historic range of the pallid sturgeon, and you can see that pallid sturgeon were found throughout the entire main stem of the Missouri River, even parts of the Yellowstone River, as well as the mid and lower Mississippi rivers. Today, however, what we see is a much more fragmented riverscape, especially in the upper river, and this is mainly due to the completion of the reservoir system in the upper river. Because they're migratory fish, they migrate upstream, but when they encounter these dams, they're no longer able to navigate past those dams and continue migrating upstream. Now, in the lower river, we still have a relatively continuous stretch of river in the Missouri River where we find pallid sturgeon. And I kind of hinted at it on the last slide there, but the other big effect here is the reduction in recruitment as a result of all these habitat changes. So in the upper river, where we have a very fragmented range to begin with, essentially we have zero recruitment. This is most likely due to the fact that during that drift phase, when those embryos are drifting 10 to 14 days, they end up settling out in the reservoirs in the upper river. And that's basically a death sentence for them. So when they settle out into the reservoir, they get buried in the anoxic sediment and are not able to survive that. In the lower river, we do see a little bit of recruitment, but it's still really, really low. And our hypothesis for that is slightly different than the upper river, because here in the lower river, we do believe that there is sufficient river miles and river distance for that drift phase to be completed. But what we are hypothesizing is that in the lower river, these embryos are not able to exit that navigation channel and find suitable habitat to where they can begin to swim on their own or feed on their own. And so here, this map kind of shows what we think is happening. So this is a depth map. On this bend, this red line represents kind of that navigation channel or the thalweg where the deepest, fastest part of the river is moving. And there are areas in the river where we can consistently go and catch age 0 sturgeon. And we typically catch those fish in more shallow habitat, so depths of 1 to 3 meters, relatively slower water velocities. And somehow they're able to escape this channel and find these more marginal habitats. I think there's a question over here real quick. So recruitment is basically the part of the life cycle where those embryos are developing into juveniles, and you have a successful completion of that life cycle. So another cohort of individuals that are raised into juveniles and then adults to where they can successfully reproduce again. Yeah. So in the lower river, we do have, it's not zero recruitment, but it's nearly zero recruitment. So the Army Corps and other agencies go out and they sample these, we call these hotspots in the river. So areas that we can go back to year after year and have relatively good success of finding age 0 sturgeon there. And so they do trawling and things like that. And that's really the question here is what makes these habitat ideal or optimum for these fish to exit this navigation channel and find their way over here. Correct. So no, yeah, that's a good point. So yes, the adults do live here. And we do see spawning in the upper river to some extent. Aaron, that's correct, I believe. Yes. Okay. But what happens is during that drift phase, so I'll jump back here, during this drift phase, so it lasts for upwards of 2 weeks. And so in this upper river, when those embryos hatch and they begin drifting downstream, they encounter these big reservoirs, and therefore they settle out in that lake environment, and they can't survive that type of environment. So the big difference between what's happening in the upper river and the lower river is in the upper river, we don't necessarily have the river distance for that drift phase to be completed. Whereas in the lower river, we do have that distance necessary, but the river has become so channelized that we are seeing limited recruitment because what we think is happening is most of the embryos are just being swept downstream. Yeah. And so what we're trying to do now is adaptively approach this management from a way that take what we know about these hotspots where we can go back and collect these early life phase sturgeon and potentially find ways to modify the channel so that we can direct passively drifting embryos out of that navigation channel and into these more suitable habitats. And so the Army Corps a couple years ago did a couple pilot projects where they initiated these interception-rearing complexes, or these IRCs that I'll refer to throughout the remainder of the talk, where they made some minor adjustments to the river in hopes of achieving just this, so that these passively drifting particles or embryos would find flow paths out of that navigation channel and into habitat that would be more suitable. And hopefully this will clear up your question a little bit here. So I'm going to go back to that drift life phase and kind of open that up a little bit more to demonstrate what is happening during this 14-day period. And so what happens here is you have the adult female, she'll migrate upstream, she'll spawn, those eggs will be fertilized, and they'll hatch. And so for those first 10 days, or roughly, it's mostly a passive drift dispersal. So those eggs or those embryos are essentially just nonchalantly drifting downstream and moving wherever the water is directing them. At some point, however, they are going to orient themselves upstream, exhibit self-swimming, potentially start feeding on their own as well. And so there's a critical transition phase in this 11 to 14-day range to where these fish are going to be able to swim on their own and feed on their own. And so we are hypothesizing that when and where these IRCs or these interception rearing complexes are useful is really going to be a function of where this female spawned at, the transport, so that distance and the transport dynamics of what really directs where those embryos are ending up along in the river, as well as the developmental stage. So are these IRCs located in a portion of the river where they can actually intercept the right life stage of those embryos to where they can intercept an embryo that is able to swim on its own or able to feed on its own, and therefore increase the success or the chance of success for that embryo to develop into a juvenile. So the Army Corps did 2 of these pilot IRCs a few years back. One of them was at Searcy Bend, just a couple miles downstream from where we're at here. And what I mentioned before is there are these minor channel configurations to hopefully alter those flow vectors in order to intercept passively drifting particles off of this navigation channel and into more suitable habitats. So what I'm showing here on this map are areas that you see red. These are where there either notches or portions of the dike were removed. And then areas that you see in green are where there are some dike additions. And again, the whole point here is to try and reconfigure these training structures to get more water flowing into these margin habitats that would likely be more suitable habitat for these early life stages. Another way that we can look at it is by looking at those flow vectors that I just mentioned. So this is Searcy's Bend again. I've just kind of reoriented the image. So flow is moving from bottom left into top right here. The black lines that you see, these are velocity vectors, so basically indicating the direction and the magnitude of where the velocity is moving. And as you would expect, the majority of that water is moving on the outside of this bend right in the navigation channel. However, if we look in this red oval here, there are a small subset of vectors that are being intercepted off of that navigation channel and into these this margin habitat where you have more shallow and slower water. And so that's was really the main motivation behind this dye release study. So we wanted to evaluate the processes that were affecting dispersal, interception, and retention, and see how the IRC at Searcy's Bend was really functioning. We chose to do a tracer study using this rhodamine dye because it provides a really good means to visualize the flow, as you can see in the image here. And we also wanted to do some remote sensing techniques to try to optimize the spatial and the temporal extent at which we were able to observe this dye. And so we did a phased approach where a couple of former colleagues of mine did a mesocosm study back in 2019 to make sure that we could actually feasibly employ some of these remote sensing techniques and have them work in a large turbid river such as the Missouri River. That was a successful study. And so again, in last May, we did the full scale study here at Searcy Bend, just a few miles downstream. So during the experiment, what we did is we released approximately 87 liters of this rhodamine dye in the river. We did that by having 2 boats line up on the center line of the channel. And then they simultaneously drove towards the river banks, releasing dye in a continual path across the entire width of the channel. And then we monitored the downstream transport of that dye with a series of different instruments and remote sensing technologies. So just to provide some location context, this is just a Google Earth screenshot of where we're at. So tonight we are sitting right here just north of the I-70 bridge. And our study site or study reach took place, again, just a couple miles downstream. And so if we jump over to where kind of a zoomed in section on our study site, our dye release transect was about 2 miles downstream of I-70 bridge here. We had 7 locations throughout the river where we were measuring the concentration of dye at a point in space throughout the duration of the study. And then we also had a transect where we were measuring the reflectance of the dye on the water. So we were basically taking a measurement of the water reflection and then correlating that to a dye concentration. Searcy's Bend IRC is right here in this gray hashed area. So right at the upstream end of that, we had an area of interest where we were collecting continual video footage of bank-to-bank coverage using drones throughout the duration of the study. And then we had a private contractor fly repeated flight passes over the entire channel or over the entire study section to give us a full coverage of the spatial extent of this study reach to be able to document dye moving down through the river. This right here, I believe that's man-made. Is that correct, Rob? Yeah. So this is Tadpole Island right here. CRC Bend IRC is on the east side of that, and then Tadpole Chute is here on the west side of that. So I'll walk through some of the qualitative results first. So these are going to be a series of images that were collected from the fixed wing aircraft that was flying those repeat flight passes over the entire spatial context of our study site. And what I've done is I've zoomed in on the portion of the river where the dye plume had the highest concentration for each flight line. So the first flight line here, this was the image that was on the background slide of my title talk, or my title slide, and this was essentially 3 minutes after we released the dye. And what you can hopefully see is that we had dye spread out across the entire channel width. And that was really important for us because in order to best evaluate dye as it moved downstream, we wanted to have complete lateral mixing across the entire channel width. About 20 minutes later on the second flight pass, you can see that the dye has moved downstream approximately 1 kilometer or so. And now we start to see some longitudinal spreading or streamwise spreading of that dye. And that's really because of the navigation channel there and the faster and deeper moving water spreading the leading edge of that dye out further downstream. What is interesting is we start to see how little training structures like this one here and this one further upstream on the bank begin to slow down some of that transport, and how a lot of the dye begins to move a lot slower along the margins of the channel. Similar story in flight line 3. So about 45 minutes after the dye was released, the leading edge of the plume is a couple more kilometers downstream, but then it's a little hard to see on the screen here, but we have this really long tail of dye coming down the right side of the channel here. Flight lines, for the sake of reference from the last slide, this is flight line 3 again with that really long tail. And then flight lines 4 and 5 is where we start to see some really interesting interactions as that dye begins to approach that IRC complex and move around that outer bend. So in flight line 4, the leading edge of the dye plume is right in here. It's beginning to make its way downstream in the navigation channel, but we also start to see a lot of dye seeping into the upstream reach of this IRC, as well as across this training structure and begin to go down into the chute. And then same with flight line 5. I don't know if you guys can actually see those dye plumes on here a little bit. Okay, I'll try to highlight them with my, okay, I'll try to highlight them with the laser here. So this is the leading edge of the dye plume here in the 5th flight line. It extends the whole way up through here. We do have some dye slowly making its way through the IRC here, but what's really interesting is at these sand bars, we have dye coming into the IRC laterally as that dye is flowing down through the navigation channel. Some of it is actually being intercepted and moving into the IRC down here as well. Again, I put flight line 5 back up for a reference point. Flight line 6 and 7, this is where we start to see essentially 2 different things happen with this dye. So again, I'll highlight the dye plumes here because it's hard to see. So the leading edge of the main dye plume is the whole way down here past station 7 already. And then we have a second dye plume that's kind of right in this area. And that is everything that was coming through that IRC. So we start to see 2 distinct plumes of dye moving through the lower end of this reach, one that was primarily coming through the navigation channel, and then the second one that was coming through the IRC. Again, we see the same here in flight line 7. I'm sure you can't even see the dye on this one, but the leading edge of the first plume is down here, and then the second plume is spread along this axis right here and is beginning to be incorporated back into the navigation channel at that point. So looking at this a little bit more quantitatively, what we can do is at each of those monitoring stations where we were observing the concentration of the dye at a single point, we can look at the breakthrough curve or the timing at which the dye reached its maximum point as it passed that station. So on this figure or this graph, I have time on the x-axis, so time since the dye released, and then the concentration on the y-axis. Essentially, if you look at the order of when the peak concentration happened, we see the first peak occurred at station 1, as you would expect, followed by station 2. It's this blue set of points behind the orange and the green. Station 3 and 4, these two that were right in the IRC, more or less had the maximum concentration right at the same time. And then logic would say that in the main channel, the next station that should peak would be 5, but what we actually see is station 7 peaks before station 5. And this is most likely due to those two separate pulses of dye that we're moving through. One that came through first in the navigation channel, and the second one that made its way much slower through this IRC. And then finally, the pink, that's station 6, that was in the chute. And so this is an important feature to us. And we see that there's a very delayed response of everything that's coming down through the chute. That means the chute probably from a design perspective necessarily isn't the best idea to have at these IRCs because the chute doesn't have a ton of suitable habitat for these embryos. And so anything that would be coming into the chute is likely going to be pushed right back into the navigation channel. And then, so I also want to briefly touch on some of the remotely sensed data that we collected and demonstrate some of the utility for what we can do with this data. So what I'm going to show here is a short video clip of the drone footage. So the shaded region here is where the footprint of these drones were flying. This video that I'm going to show, it's a combination of 6 or 7 different videos. So we would have one drone flying while the other one was charging, and then we would switch out. So the frame of reference is going to jump around a little bit. It was really windy, and so it is going to bounce around. And so just kind of a heads up, hopefully it doesn't make you super dizzy. But what you're looking at, the sandbar here is just slightly underwater. Everything to the right of that is a navigation channel. Everything to the left of that is kind of the upstream part of the IRC. So as this plays, you can start to see the leading edge of the dye plume in the thalweg or that navigation channel make its way through. And this is sped up probably 10 or 12 times real time. And so it's quite a while until you start to see any dye come through the IRC. And even the dye that's coming through here, it still hasn't really reached its peak yet. And by this point, most of the dye is moving through the navigation channel. And now we start to see the peak dye concentration come through the IRC. And we also start to see some trailing from way up here continue to just seep through this IRC even after the dye in the navigation channel has been completely swept through. So what we can do with this type of data is we had 2 of those monitoring stations. So station 3 and station 4 are right about here and here. So what we can do is we can take the dye concentration from those monitoring stations and make continuous maps of dye concentration for that area where we had the drone footage. So what I'm showing here is basically a concentration map of the dye moving through the IRC. Now this is for only about a 5-minute time period. This is the navigation channel over here. So the majority of that dye has already moved forward. And I'm really only simulating or showing the maximum concentration of dye moving through the IRC. But this now gives us the ability to look at a spatial distribution of dye concentration over a much broader area than just having, like back here, a single point in space to analyze the dye. Yeah.
So overall, what we find that more dye in the channel than your IRC?
Most likely, yes. So it's actually a tricky question, because if we look at the breakthrough curves, it would recommend that the 2 stations right in the IRC actually had the highest concentration of dye. But the tricky part here is where the other stations were at, we weren't actually able to get those right in the navigation channel for safety and logistic reasons. And so we actually didn't capture the highest concentration of dye at those locations. So to answer your question, yes, it most likely is true that the highest amount or concentration of dye was still in the navigation channel. Is there another question?
You know what the
Yeah, the question was, what was the river level during this experiment? I think it was right around 60,000 CFS. Does that help? I know cubic. So the Boonville gauge was probably right around 60,000. Oh, stage. Off the top of my head. So if this is an actual aerial image of the day of that study, so as Carrie was saying, you can, some of these wing dikes here were just right at the water surface. Okay, so as I was mentioning, this video coverage, again, it just enhances the spatial analysis that we're able to do compared to having those point locations in the river. Another benefit of this remotely sensed data, or application of this remotely sensed data rather, was this spectra data that we collected. And so we were driving a repeat transect at the same location back and forth, channel to channel throughout the study. And that allowed us to look at how the dye concentration varied across the channel width. And so what I'm showing on these two graphs is on the x-axis is basically the distance across the channel. So we'll just call this river left here and river right over here, and then a concentration value on the y. The red is the concentration that we inferred from the reflectance data off of the water. And the black line is the actual concentration data that we measured. And so we saw that the reflectance data had a really strong correlation to the actual concentration, meaning that we can now employ this method to get a better spatial coverage yet again, in this case, by driving repeat transects. And so the first, or the top graph here, shows one point in time where we are able to capture the plume of the dye coming downstream, where the highest concentration was right in the center of the channel. So we likely caught relatively close to the leading edge of the dye plume. And then a couple transects later, the dye had moved through the middle of the channel here and was now more concentrated on the river bank. And so this is just yet one more way that we can use this remotely sensed data to provide a better spatial and even temporal component to understanding some of these really complex transport processes. And then finally, with the aerial imagery that was collected from the fixed wing aircraft, what we've been able to do with this is look at a relative dye concentration to look at the spatial distribution at certain areas of interest and how that dye would have been moving through that at these snapshot of time and throughout the study. And so each of these lines are about 20 minutes apart. And so we can begin to look at, for example, like flight line 4, some really unique interactions of how that main dye plume is coming down through the thalweg and the navigation channel, but we also have some dye coming into the IRC as well. And then the other component of this project is using this data set to improve our modeling efforts. So I mentioned at the very beginning that in the River Studies branch, one of the tools that we have at our disposal is using hydrodynamic and particle tracking models to incorporate some of these biological components into the hydrodynamics and transport processes. And so my co-PI, Bruce Call, who's here this evening with me, he's been doing a lot of this particle tracking modeling work to where he's using a hydrodynamic model to solve governing equations that will basically dictate where the water is moving based on mass and momentum. And then he's taking that and using a three-dimensional particle tracking model to where these particles are now simulating a particle that is passively drifting through that study reach. So this provides a couple different useful tools. In this case, it provides some evaluation to this IRC design and performance. It also allows us to identify things like the areas of retention or different interception pathways so that we can have a better understanding of how certain transport phenomena would be affecting where and when something like a passively drifting embryo would be located and transported along a river continuum. One issue with some of these models, though, is there's a lack of real-world data to actually calibrate and evaluate the model too. And so this dye study provides a ton of really good data to evaluate the performance of this particle tracking model. So here are a couple of demonstrations of what those particle tracking models look like. I'm showing different dispersion coefficients. So this is one parameter that we can use to better refine our model. And essentially what you're seeing are particles that are essentially just passively moving downstream. And this could be something to simulate, for example, like the dye study, or these particles could represent embryos. But again, it gives us a means to evaluate how some of these flow structures and how those particles are interacting with those flow structures as they move downstream. As far as the comparison to the dye study, we found some relatively good agreement between the timing and the breakthrough curves for the dye study compared to the particle tracking model for everything that was happening in the main channel. You'll notice on these breakthrough curves, I pulled out station 3 and 4. Those were those two stations that were right in the IRC. And you can see that the timing and even the relative magnitude of either the particle or the dye concentration or the number of particles is pretty similar in the simulated particle tracking model to what we observed in the dye study. However, when we add in stations 3 and 4, we start to see some differences. So the real world test data from the dye study showed that stations 3 and 4 more or less had the peak concentration at the same time. And we don't really resolve that in the model yet. And so some of these issues are likely due to a very complex geometry as a result of what's happening in the IRC. So the figure I'm showing on the left here is just a snapshot in time of the particle tracking model. So all of these white dots are those particles that Bruce has been simulating. The black circles here are where station 3 and station 4 were respectively. And you can see that coming off of station 3, there's some really unique flow features where you have this oscillation and some really big macro turbulence coming through that IRC. Whereas in the dye release study, we didn't necessarily see big oscillations like that. We saw more of linear transport right in here. And so this is just useful for us to be able to evaluate this model and understand where the model does well and some areas where there might be some limitations to these models. Mm-hmm. So yes, that is a good point. So what we're seeing with the dye is mostly surface level. So the dye does not allow us to necessarily see what's happening under the surface. With the particle tracking, I believe, Bruce, you have this throughout the entire water column. Yeah, so these particles, because it's three-dimensional, those particles could be anywhere in that water column. And so we could be comparing apples and oranges here when it comes to some of these bigger macro turbulent structures. I think there's a question in the back. Yeah, so the question was, where in the water column do the sturgeon drift? And for the most part, towards the bottom. They're probably constrained within the lower, I would say 1 to maybe 2 meters. Because if you think they incubate, so when they are fertilized, they are incubating in the sediment and then they hatch. And so they're hatching from the sediment and remaining fairly low at that sediment level interface. So to wrap things up here, we found that this particle tracking model provides some really useful insights to the flow and dispersion at not just what's happening at Searcy's Bend, but Bruce has been doing some of these models at other reaches on the Missouri River as well. We did, with the comparison to the dye study, we did see some slight differences in timing. And again, as we saw in that last slide, there may be some issues of macro turbulence not being captured well at one of the levels, whether it's the dye study or the particle tracking model. So moving forward and kind of looking at some of the lessons learned, as always in these studies, you probably wish you put more dye into the river. It's easier to see more dye. I'm sure as you guys were seeing as I was marching through those aerial images, by flight lines 6 and 7, it was really hard to pick up the dye. And you guys are sitting way back there. I'm at my computer screen. I can see it a little bit easier, but it was still really hard to pick up some of that dye plume as the experiment went on. I mentioned a little bit throughout the talk, those fixed monitoring locations. I addressed a question, how we had to strategically place those at select locations. So we had to be concerned about not putting this expensive instrumentation right in the navigation channel, but we also wanted to strategically place those locations at areas of interest in the IRC to see what was happening there. And then we have lots and lots of data. So there's a ton of different data sets that we're working with and trying to analyze. After looking at this, we do think that IRC is functioning in a way to both intercept and retain some of these passively drifting particles. We saw that in these images here where you have those two distinct plumes or dye plumes coming through, one in the navigation channel and one that's moving much slower through the IRC. And then this modeling and the remote sensing data, this is really providing some cutting edge science to improve our capabilities to answer some of these really complex questions. So moving forward, there's still a number of questions that we have kind of related to the developmental rate, the vertical distribution in the water, where exactly are these embryos at as they continue to drift downstream, and related to that, the effect of sandy bed forms. So the Missouri River is a sand-bedded river, and there's really large bed forms in there, and it could be that these embryos are able to find refugia behind those bed forms. So the images or the videos that you're looking at here are some pilot flume studies where we're looking at how a one-day post-hatch embryo is drifting. You can see it kind of just floating down through, just again, passively drifting. It's subjected to the movement of the water compared to a fish that has just come out of that transition phase and it's actually oriented itself upright or upstream and can swim a little bit on its own. So here at CERC, we are eagerly anticipating the addition of a new research flume that will allow us to answer some of these questions and really get at looking at, observing some of these really delicate life forms on a much smaller scale that we just can't do out on the Missouri River. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the questions throughout, and I can continue to answer the questions. So I've been asked for questions. Go ahead and raise your hand. We'll pass the microphone around, and I'll try to repeat the question as well. So thank you. Wayne?
Oh, Brandon, how much actual volume of the solution did you drop into the lake, and how much of a problem was the logistics of spreading that volume, so much dye that you could see it from the air?
Yeah, so the question was how much volume of dye did we distribute and kind of what was the logistic procedures behind that? So we had 87 liters of 20% solution dye, and then we diluted that in half. And so then we essentially spread that between two separate boats. And in each boat we call it the dye release apparatus. We had a big 55-gallon jug or drum set up on a stand, and basically just a simple 2-inch hose and a ball valve. And when we gave the order to dump the dye, each boat just opened up the ball valves and then drove off. And they had done a number of test drives beforehand to get that timing down. So it was really important for us to get that dye released in a single transect. As you see here, we did have a little bit of dye kind of fade back through here, but it would have, if we would have had to continue that dye release in a second phase, it would have made for some really complex breakthrough curves. And so it was really important to get that timing down to where when the boat started here and ended here, all the dye was gone. And for the most part, we were able to achieve that. Yes.
I'm not sure folks are aware, but these are the only two IRCs that have been built. There's been a moratorium on them since then, but it's expected that 2 of those will be designed, so identified and designed this summer. Will the particle tracking models that you're using now be incorporated in the evaluation of the design options of those IRCs? The previous, when Circe was designed, it was pretty primitive.
Yeah, so I'll put up this slide. So the comment in question was only 2 IRCs have been designed so far, one at Circe, I believe the second one is at Moberly, and the plan is to design 2 more moving into this summer. And then the question was, are we going to employ these particle tracking models to evaluate the design as well as the performance of these? I think I would say to be determined. And maybe Rob can provide a little more insight into that.
Yeah, we work very closely with the Corps of Engineers, and we have been invited to work with them on the design of those, but whether this particular particle tracking model will be incorporated or not does remain to be seen. There's always a question of, one model is thought to be better than another model, and the Corps is pretty happy about their model and not as kind about our model. But so it does remain to be seen. But particle tracking models will be used, and we hope that the dye trace shows that particle tracking models can be valuable and realistic tools.
Got a question up here.
So what was the full length of time that it took before the dye had completely dispersed?
Yeah, so the question was, what was the full length of time before the dye had completely dispersed? In the main channel, I'll actually flip back to the breakthrough curves real quick. It was only a couple of hours. About 2.5, 3 hours, the dye had more or less returned really close back to the background concentrations in the navigation channel and the IRC. However, in that shoot, we actually pulled that fluorometer way too soon. We should have left it overnight and into the next day, because when we pulled it, and I've actually truncated it here, I think we pulled it 6.5 or 7 hours after we released the dye, and there was still, it was still registering concentrations above the background. So we should have left that overnight and let it, continue recording. So definitely some really interesting prolonged transport happening through that chute. Okay, I think back here first. I can repeat the question for you.
Okay. So the question was asked earlier if the shoots were helping with Pallid Sturgeon. Recruitment, I think is the word you were using.
Mhm.
And so the response was the habitat wasn't good or favorable. What kind of habitat is it missing?
Yeah, so I'll keep it here. So the question was, I had made a comment earlier how the habitat isn't appropriate necessarily for those early life stages of development. And the question here is what habitat is missing. So what you'll see in the chute here is it's basically just another straight channel that acts to convey water through it. The habitat that's really needed is a lot of this close margin habitat towards the bank, where you have more shallow depths of 1 to 3 meters per se, and slower moving water to allow these fish that are coming out of that drifting phase to be able to find slower moving water so they can swim and hold their position. But then the other part of that is foraging habitat. And so in these shallower areas, you're going to have a diversity in the type of habitat, and therefore diversity in the organisms are there, and the ability of food to be present to sustain those earlier life stages. Question up front?
Well, I was wondering that very question, so you just answered.
Okay, great. One back here.
So continuing on that line in that chute, which is maybe poor habitat for this stage of these fish, how is that habitat for other stages of that fish, adult fish, spawning fish? And it's all that money they spent back there doing something.
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure. I would assume that it's probably not the most ideal habitat, especially for spawning. They're likely going to find a hardcore substrate that is in a deeper part of the water. So when those eggs hatch, they can be incorporated into the drift a little bit easier. But I might also pull Aaron or Rob's advice in on this one as well.
So we've tracked upstream migrating adult fish through some of these chutes. It appears to be a less energetically demanding pathway. But one of the things about comparing these chutes is that every single chute you look at is different. And that makes it very difficult to say that, to generalize about how they work. So the Lisbon chute, for example, is wide and shallow, and there seems to be a lot of good early life history habitat there. This one is relatively young in the sense that they constructed it and it was meant to widen and get shallow, but it's taken a long time to do that. And that just shows that it's, constructing one of these chutes for habitat is really an art form. It's not a science.
Thank Carrie, do you have a response to that?
This chute at the top now is completely cut off from the river. So dye and water can go down it, but a larvae on the bottom probably isn't gonna, unless the flow is really, really high, isn't gonna end up there. And a migrating adult probably isn't gonna be able to get through. So there are a lot of control structures that have been augmented in this section because there were some problems with navigation in the channel.
Back here real quick.
Of the chute and what are they doing here? At the lower end of that chute, yeah, right there. Why did they build that? What's its function?
I honestly don't know. Up front here?
One thing we didn't really discuss was what is the outlook for the sturgeon's future? I mean, how dire, what kind of situation are we at? I know we want to improve,
Right.
The situation, but what is the current status?
Yeah. So the question is, what is the current status of Pallid sturgeon? And so they are still endangered. And so there's still a need to continue learning more about these critical life stages, as well as augmenting their population. So there are some efforts to augment population with hatchery raised fish. Aaron might be able to speak on the specific status a little bit more. That's beyond my area of expertise.
Sure. There's some good news and there's bad news, right? It's still an endangered species in the upper river, in the fragmented reservoir reaches. There still is no natural recruitment, meaning that reproduction is occurring, but the progeny or the young sturgeon aren't growing up into small sturgeon and into adult sturgeon. The good news is that there are management actions both planned and underway. One that just opened up was the intake dam passage on the lower Yellowstone to allow adults to move upstream and hopefully spawn further upstream. There's planned flow releases potentially out of Fort Peck Dam to do the same thing to help sturgeon move upstream and spawn. On the lower river, we have changes to channel modifications to increase interception and rearing. And at the same time, we also have an active propagation program that's going on both in the upper river and the lower river that is forestalling extirpation or extinction in both portions of the river. And that's a fairly successful program. So I can't say things are getting worse, but there's hope that they'll get better.
Aaron.
Sorry, Brandon. That was a tremendous amount of data that you showed. That's many hours of data collection and analyses and work. I mean, there's aircraft and there's drones and there's fluorometers and there's boats driving around collecting bathymetry with sounders and velocity with ADCPs and collecting reflectance data and the dye and the whole thing and a raft of people. How typical is that for research to support management for a species on a river for the size of the Missouri River. Is that just a typical Wednesday at USGS? Or is it somewhat unique?
It's a
Just to provide some context.
very unique. So to provide some context, I joined CERC in September of 2020, and I believe this project was actually planned to happen the week I joined. It got pushed back for logistic reasons. It might have been COVID constrictions, might have been we had a lot of issues getting the aircraft contracted out to fly for us. And then the water levels weren't cooperating for a while. So it got delayed at least, I think, 2 times before I arrived, and then an additional 2 or 3 times after I arrived. So I wasn't even supposed to be the PI on this project initially. And so then it finally happened, 6 or 9 months after I got here. And during that time, we had to sub out the flight contractor that we initially had. I think like 2 or 3 weeks before, we had to scramble around and get another contractor to do that for us. So this was a massive effort with a number of agencies and individuals involved. And no, it is not a typical Wednesday in the office for us.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know that the sturgeon is a kind of an indicator fish. It's a top of the food chain. How is the engineering of the river affecting other species? I mean, does accommodating the sturgeon adversely impact other species?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, how does re-engineering or reconfiguring the river affect other species? And I would say that it most likely is going to benefit these other organisms. So so if you go back to some of my intro slides where I was talking about how we've lost certain critical habitat, the channel has been heavily, the river has been heavily channelized. We don't have connection to the floodplain. We've lost those side channels and those large sand islands and whatnot. And those were all different types of habitat that these aquatic organisms liked and needed for their survival. And so by trying to reconfigure the channel in a way that, is really targeted at one specific species, it's going to have additional effects that are likely going to benefit other species as well, simply through increasing the diversity of habitat that is present. So by adding additional habitat or different types of habitat, that's going to allow for a diversity of organisms to respond, benefit, or positively respond to that as well.
I have a question too, and I'm going to ask you, but there may be,
Yeah.
I'm curious, like if Carrie and Rob and others, Aaron, have an opinion too. So we've seen the whole cycle on tadpole shoot from this little pilot channel to something that was dynamic and changing, and then they started pouring rock into it and changing it, and now they've essentially killed the shoot. And we don't know. I don't really know. Maybe you guys know, like, if it's actually going to silt in or what's going to happen. But just kind of curious from the perspective of scientists who've been studying the pallid sturgeon and other fish in the river, to have this experiment on the landscape happen, and now decisions have been made to essentially kill it. Like, for one thing, is that going to happen all up and down the river, and then secondly, it's like from a scientific perspective, like how do we feel about that? I know scientists don't feel things. But...
Rob, you want to take that one?
Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there, Steve. But one of the things that's very clear is that these chutes make the navigation industry and the Corps of Engineers very nervous, because any chute takes water out of the navigation channel, and that means that there's less opportunities for that water to maintain the depths needed for the barges. At the same time, the National Research Council pointed out that the Corps has never established that the chutes have all that much value to the pallid sturgeon, so that hasn't been well developed. So the the impetus, the motivation for the shoots has been decreasing over time. And especially after the 2019 flood, when there were a lot of perceived problems with navigation, a lot of that was laid at the feet of IRCs, previous shallow water habitat projects, and shoots. And so the emphasis now has been on trying to decrease the amount of water in the shoots, which means there's going to be a decrease in the amount of habitat and the availability of that habitat. From a scientific point of view, well, at our agency, we just, do the science. We don't really have much to say about the policy, but it's, it would, from the point of view of carrying out science, it'd be interesting if the shoots would be left alone for a while so that they could evolve through time. Because once the shoot is constructed, it evolves. And one of the big unknowns is how long is it going to take to evolve into a more natural form. And the one at Tadpole, it's a constructed shoot, but it turns out to be constructed in a place where a natural historical shoot was. So the sediment is very fine and cohesive, which means that those processes of widening have been relatively slow to take place. Versus places like Lisbon, where it was uncontrolled for a long time period and a lot of water went through there and it got wide and shallow. And there's a lot of good habitat there. So again, it's an art form. The engineering of shoots is an uncertain process. And the future, I think, depends a lot on trying to establish their ecological value compared to the risks that they present to navigation.
That was very daring of you. And it killed the video camera too. I don't know why.
I could be daring because I'm very close to retire.
All right. Any other questions? One more?
Yeah, I'd like to, there was a question earlier about whether or not the work that's done for Pallid Sturgeon is benefiting other fishes. And you gave a good answer, because if you're trying to benefit habitat for one species, other species are going to have some positive effect. But I'd like to expand on that a little bit, because it raises questions about the purpose of the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is designed to help individual species, and consequently, the efforts that are going into the sorts of things you see today, by law, are required to benefit that species and the ecosystem which supports it, but very little effort goes into determining whether or not the second part of that occurs. I could give you all kinds of examples of where structures that were built under the shallow water habitat program had problems for, native turtles and a bunch of other things. But fundamentally, you're talking about two different kinds of fish, two different kinds of groups of fish. Pallid sturgeon are large, long-lived riverine fishes. Other fish like that in the river would be things like blue suckers, for example. And there's several others. There's a whole other group of fish out there in the Missouri River, which are being proposed for federal listing now. And they're called the Macrobopsis chubs, sickle chub, sickle fin chub. There's a few other species, but the sickle fin's the one that's more common. They're totally different. They're small, short-lived fish. They spawn at different times. Their eggs drift. Everything about them is different than Pallid sturgeon. So the idea that what we're doing for Pallid sturgeon is going to help everything else is not really all that accurate, because the endangered species, first of all, doesn't allow it. It's focused on a single species. And secondly, fish are incredibly diverse. Fish in the Missouri River are incredibly diverse. What you do focused on the life history that you just saw here may not help, and in fact may do something negative to other fish out there that have totally different life histories that are equally imperiled in the river. I'm not saying that will occur, but the point is that you have to look at the suite of species and the differences that each one of them has before you assume that what I do for one species is going to benefit everybody. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good response and something. So, you know, I'm not a biologist per se by training. And so I probably overgeneralize that a little bit. And so that's good to keep in mind. And it isn't a one species approach. Thank you. Any other questions, I guess, real quick? Otherwise, all right, thank you guys.
Brandon, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I also wanted to do a few other shout outs, you guys. So first of all, Drew in the back. Thank you, Drew. Drew's our board president and also has worked with Les Bourgeois or at Les Bourgeois for like years and years. So they actually donate this space to us, which is actually astonishing and amazing. They've been doing it for years. I also want to give a huge thank you to David Owens. He brings all of this equipment for free and takes our sound just way up, you know, and the lighting and everything. So hugely appreciated, and it makes our, you know, online presence really nice. I think people have enjoyed that. Also, Melanie for coming out and first of all lending her laptop, which she hates to do. Thank you. I get my greasy fingers on it and stuff, and set everything up so that you guys can find out a little bit more about what we do. One last thing, we do have a little questionnaire. It's an online questionnaire about the Big Muddy Speaker Series. And there's a QR code back there where you can shoot it with your phone and do this quick little survey. That'll help us capture a little bit of data about it. And we really appreciate all of the data that we can collect. And maybe we'll make some cool point fields and like modeling for you. We'll have Brandon pull that together in his free time. Also, Crystal came here today. Crystal Ryan came here today to like start to learn this audio thing, which she's never done before. And that's just the kind of person Crystal is. She's like, yeah, I'll do that. And then all of a sudden we're shoving mics in her hands and everything else too. So muchas gracias. I think that's it. Thank you guys.